Ah, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about gender. Before we do that, I kind of want to just talk about our current situation with the election. First of all, normally when I'm teaching this class, I leave politics out of it. My objective is to hopefully get you the critical thinking skills to help analyze, what's going on in the world out there, and you make up your own mind. So I don't bring my own politics in. But we're in a very interesting time. I'm filming this on Sunday, so President-elect Joe Biden was sort of confirmed yesterday, and this election period has been just very, very intense, and so many issues going on in the world, and it's not going to get any easier, right? Even though we have a new president that's going to be stepping in over the next few weeks, it's not going to be particularly pretty. There are accusations, unfounded accusations that there's been voter suppression and all this stuff, and what we're anticipating is that this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be fun. Just because the election is sort of over now, doesn't mean it's necessarily going to end. So in the next coming weeks, be careful with what you're doing out there, and be aware of where you are, what you're doing, and who else is around you. Because in these times, when we're going through so much stress because of the pandemic, because of the economy, because of the election, sometimes people do stupid things. And so I encourage all of you to, be safe, stay healthy, and really try and, look at what's going on around all of this stuff, and see if you can't, bridge gaps. Okay, whatever side that you're on, I think it's really important to, instead of creating more division, bridge those gaps. As in anthropology, our objective would be to try and understand what's going on. If we're talking about politics, part of what we need to do is create that civil discourse. And that's something I think is sorely missing in this political realm right now, is civil discourse, and looking more at the commonalities between people, because I think the values that most Americans hold are very, very similar, and there's very few differences in those values. Sometimes there are, and we've talked about how there can be dissent or contradiction in those values. But a lot of them do align. And if people recognize that people are more similar than they are different, they might be more willing to communicate. So when you're out there and you're discussing all of this stuff going on with, your friends and your family, and they might have differing opinions, I encourage you to listen more and talk less. I heard this great comment on the news the other day, and I think it was NPR that I heard it. And the commentator was saying, and I can't remember exactly what the context was, but I think he was mentioning that his grandfather had told him that, you're born with two ears and one mouth. So you should do twice as much listening and half as much talking. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. I think if we were better at listening to people, and better at listening to what their issues are and what their problems are, then we might get around some of these major issues. And then sharing our own experiences and sharing the experiences of others, that we might be able to connect once again. Because we have, if anything, this political cycle has shown us is that we are a very divided nation right now. And so when you're out there and you're talking to your friends and you're talking to your family, I encourage you to think critically, listen more than you talk, and just try and understand why, right? Ask them why. If they have an opinion about something, and help them to understand, right? You don't necessarily have to fight about something that you disagree with, but if you help them to get them to make you understand, maybe they can, understand it better as well. And sometimes if they find holes in their arguments, then they might change their mind about things. So again, when it comes down to it, be kind to each other, speak in peaceful ways, and try and build those bridges that we desperately need to sort of bring back everyone together and talk about all the issues that we are facing, because there are a ton of issues that we have been dealing with. I mean, the fact that racism has become such a huge part of this election, and gender equality and sexual rights and immigration and all of these things, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about over the course of this semester, there's a lot of divisions. There's a lot of different ideas about what's going on. And if we're gonna try and fix any of this, we need to understand what's going on and what people think about it. So I hope that as you are going out there and talking to people, think critically about this stuff, and let your curiosity, ask those questions. Why, and why do you think this? And see if you can't come up with some of those answers. And you might be able to help, us as a society figure out some of these problems. So, that being said, as you're going out there, be safe, be healthy. Thank you for voting if you voted. If you didn't vote, I think this is a great election to realize that your votes actually do count. Especially when you look at the margins of some of these elections and how close they've been. So if you didn't vote this time, I really encourage you to vote the next time. Okay, so moving on to gender. I think for this first topic that we're going to be discussing, are men and women born or made? And this is a sticky kind of conversation, because anthropologists, we make the distinction between like sex and gender. Okay, sex is the biological component. That's what you're born with, right? Your genitalia, your gonads, your ovaries. That's your sex, right? Your gender itself is your identity. Okay, it's identity, and it's culturally based. Okay, gender is culturally based. but they go hand in hand. Okay, your sex, your sexual identity, your what you're born with, and then your gender. We have certain expectations about what gender means and what it represents. So we have to talk about that, figure out how we determine, what these things actually are. So, because we live in sort of a Judeo-Christian society, we basically have this dualistic idea about gender. There's male or there's female, and that in our society, our culture has kind of determined that. But there's a lot of other cultures that don't see it in that dualistic approach, that binary approach. And even our own society right now is realizing that there is a multi-spectrum of gender identity or gender neutrality, in which we identify with one group or without a group, and that's okay, right? And so we're going to be talking about that. Gender is the cultural expectation and practice of a community as it assigns roles to sex. Okay, so basically, we've determined what it means to be male, female, and everything else, non-cisgender. Talking a little bit about the biology, we have what's called sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism is basically the differences between the sexes. So the human male, on average, is about 15% larger in body size than women are. So what that means is that men have a tendency to be a little bit bigger, a little bit bulkier, and might be a little bit stronger on average. But that 15% is a pretty small margin. And because of the diversity of our species, we oftentimes sort of say, well, women can't do this because this might be too physically difficult. And we've had this discussion when it comes to the military, or if firefighters, or and whether or not women should be involved in those kinds of activities because they're not as strong, right? They're not as physically strong. Which, I don't know if you've seen women athletes who are pretty, badass. They in general can do the job. So, and I think it all comes down to, if we're going to be talking about gender equality, it's if you can do it, you should be allowed to do it, right? And there can be exceptions that, if you're 5'5" and 150 pounds, man or woman, I don't know if being a firefighter is the job for you, right? Because you just might not have the strength. But that should be for both genders, right? Anyway, so I'm kind of digressing here. So men and women have this 15% sexual dimorphism. If we compare it to, say, gorillas, male gorillas are usually twice as large as female gorillas. So if you see in the documentaries, you've got those big silverbacks, big, huge freaking gorillas. Whew, and then you look at the female gorillas, and they're not all that big. So, there's usually a reason why there's such big differences in sexual dimorphism. For humans, we're pretty equal when it comes to what we're capable of doing, and we're going to be talking more about the equality of what we're capable of as we go throughout this lecture. Um, we've also talked about how biology can be influenced by our environment. So again, if we've got a lot of protein, if we've got good water, depending on where we grow up, we can see big differences in how we develop. If you have a lot of protein and you're really active, you're going to build a lot of muscle, right? And that it doesn't matter, what sex you are, that's going to take place. So, as communities develop, they're going to develop in different ways according to their environment. And those genes then get expressed in different ways. So we know that our biology is affected by culture, right, and by our environment. So so we know that biology can be affected. How our bodies can be impacted by the environment. Let's talk about our cultural construction of gender. And what a lot of this comes down to is that we basically are taught our roles on how to be a male or a female, right? And everything else, right? Gender is culturally constructed. So what does that mean? Well, basically everything that we do is a reflection of our gender. So our daily lives, the way that we dress, right? What kind of clothing we wear. This shirt that I'm wearing is masculine, right? I don't know if it is masculine, but it's just a shirt. But it is kind of masculine, right? You don't see women wearing exactly this shirt. In fact, we have a distinction in which men and women's shirts are made differently so that they button on different sides, right? And so that's kind of wild, But hey, this is a man's shirt, this is a woman's shirt. This is a man's shirt might oftentimes be more rugged, right? This is a Carhartt shirt, right? It's Carhartt, it's tough, right? And so that's why I like it, right? Because it's tough. How we dress is very much a cultural decision, right? From the types of pants or dresses that we wear, socks, jewelry, makeup, all of that is cultural. Because if we go back into other cultures, right? If we're talking about American culture right now, but if we go back to, let's say France, 200 years ago, well, men wore high heels. In fact, that's where high heel shoes came from, was France, and it was men that wore them, right? It gave them, an extra few inches, but that was the style. It was done by men. Men wore makeup, right? And wore frilly things. Did that make them any less masculine, right? Any less tough? Because they also ran around with swords, and especially if you're talking about like nobility and stuff. These ideas about like what is male and what is female are very much constructed, right? We might not see the French 200 years ago as being tough and whatever, but they were just as tough. If we're talking about manliness, whatever that represents. Hair, right? As a thing, like most men, cut their hair short in the United States, and that's typically a male haircut. You do see men with long hair, but it isn't common, right? You might see it every once in a while. But that is a cultural decision. That is something that we identify as a cultural trait, that most men do this. If a man were to grow his hair out longer, that might be seen as a rebellious thing, right? Like who do we oftentimes associate with long hair? Like rock and roll. You got uh, rock and roll stars that grow their hair out long, uh, and it's wild, it's rebellious, you know. And so we see this change in what's appropriate, right? Rebellious ideas that go against the mainstream. And that's where we see, like, our cultural norms and our cultural values being tested, is these ideas. So it's not just how we look, but it's how we talk, the way that we use our language, right? That can very much be influenced by gender ideals. How we learn, how we react to conflict, how we do sports, the military, going to school. One of the interesting things that I always found fascinating, there are more women that go to to college and to university than there are men. But there are more professional men out there. Why is that? Even within the realm of anthropology, there's usually like a 2-to-1 ratio of women to men in college anthropology classes. That ratio probably isn't as close. It might be more close to like 60-40. So there's more women that study anthropology, that get degrees in anthropology. But if you look at practicing anthropologists, there are more men. Why is that? Why is there a difference between, what you go to school for and then what you end up working as? And we see this take place for a number of different reasons. And part of it is that women take on, again, another gender responsibility, oftentimes family and homemaking, right? Because in Western culture, and certainly in American culture, women are oftentimes seen as the homemaker, right? Let's say you meet somebody when you're in college, and you're an aspiring anthropologist, and you're getting your degree, and you meet someone, and you're like, man, I'm in love with this person, and you get married, and then you decide to have kids. Well, women in general in this culture are the caretakers. And so they will oftentimes put their careers on hold to become that career, or that caretaker, and that parent figure, where the man who will go off to work, and there is still this pay gap between men and women, right? Men will make more money. And so it only makes sense. If we know that men make more money than women, even if they're doing the same job, and are just as capable, then it makes sense if the woman, stays home and takes care of the kids, right? Well, I'm not exactly sure if that makes sense. But that's how we've done it, right? That's how our cultures have kind of based our ideas off of. So, when we're looking at this, we have to sort of look at these different ideas about the differences between the genders. Mr. Bear, what are we doing? Come on, back up. There we go. Oh, nope. Hold on. Yeah, okay. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. So, where was I? So, gender is constructed, right? The things that we accept to be men, to be male traits or to be female traits, are basically placed upon individuals. And that's how we grow up. So, and they are constantly reinforced, right? Why is it appropriate for women to wear dresses and not for men to wear dresses, right? Unless you're, Scottish, and then you can wear a kilt, but isn't a kilt just a dress? I mean, isn't it? Same concept, right? Same way it's worn. But it's not, it's a kilt, right? We have to make that distinction. And if you're man enough to wear a kilt, right? Man enough to wear a kilt, man, you're pretty tough, right? I don't know. So for this week's exercise, I want you guys to consider what do we determine to what do we do to determine gender culturally? Okay, what are different things that we associate with gender? And so my first example here is, why do we assign colors to gender? Okay, and for example, because this has been in the news lately, gender reveal parties, right? We have gender reveal parties where we're going to find out whether or not it's going to be a boy or a girl, and how do we determine that, right? What do we use visually to determine male versus female? Well, blue is for boys and pink is for girls. I want to ask this question. Who said blue is for boys and pink is for girls? There is absolutely nothing that says that blue is for boys, right? There's zero. There's absolutely nothing that makes that determination, except for our culture. We made a decision that as we organize things, right, going back to our mental maps, right, how we organize things, we place certain things in masculine boxes, right? And the color blue is seen as masculine. And the color pink is seen as feminine, even though there's no direct correlation between those two things, right? So, what other ways do we determine gender, right? And there's lots of ways that we do this. So a few more examples. Names, right? Names. There are male names and there are female names. What makes them male or female? They're just sounds that we are creating in our mouths, right? They're just sounds. But what makes them identify as male or female? Why is Frank or Joe or Ted or Gustav? Why are these male names, and why is Alexandria or Sarah or what else is a good? Anyway, you get my point, right? What makes those names distinctly female, and what makes them male? Well, if we're talking about names, oftentimes we use names that are common, right? Where do we learn about those names? Well, oftentimes, if you think about certain names, David, Joseph, Sarah, Eve, Adam, right? You find them in religious texts. So we might have religious influence on naming practices, and religion in general is oftentimes very much an important factor into how we distinguish gender, because religion is so important to many cultures. And we look at the Judeo-Christian sort of pathway, And we see this binary tract, right? That there's distinct men and there's distinct women, and naming accordingly and whatnot. But if you look at other cultures that are a little bit more diverse when it comes to gender identity or sexual identity, you might find different expressions, right? Doctors, right? Doctors determine gender. How do they do that? Well, because let's say when you're born, and we'll get to this in a second, but not everyone is born strictly male or strictly female. Sometimes we're born with a little bit of both. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So doctors can help determine what side, what pathway you end up going down. Family, right? Your family is going to determine, how they treat you, right? You're outside playing with your friends or with your cousins, your neighbors, and if you're a boy and you fall down and scrape your knee, you're told to, just brush it off, right? Be tough, right? Be tough. If you're a little girl and you fall down and scrape your knee, you're treated very differently, right? It's not the same. You're tough, you're tough. Oh, sweetheart, come here, let me fix that for you. There's a difference. There's a difference between how we treat children, right? Male children and female children, and how we treat them on a regular basis, right? Just by doing those small acts, right? Oftentimes we teach boys sports from a very early age, how to throw a baseball. We encourage them to, play sports at a very early age. We don't necessarily do that with women, even though we know that women are just as capable as athletes, right? But we assign different tasks. So as we're developing, as we're looking at this, families have a huge impact into how we identify. Friends, right? Who your friends are, how you associate with them. If you're a male and you're into sports, then you see a whole bunch of your teammates. They behave a certain way, right? They act a certain way, and so you are expected to act in a similar way because you want to be associated with them. And to do that, you have to be similar. You have to show similar traits. So your friends can help reinforce these gender identity roles. School, right? If you go to a school that's got a strict dress code, right? Do girls have to wear skirts? How long do those skirts have to be? What is considered to be appropriate? Do you have to wear a certain shirt, right? Where men, just wear pants or shorts. There's not a whole lot of distinction, right? But women oftentimes have more restrictions as far as what they're allowed to wear, what is appropriate to wear. Government. Yeah, government is a huge one, has been for a long time, oftentimes because government is the representation of the people. And so if we look at how, government and also religion as well, this comes into power and identity, and who's in control of what. So, if you live in a community or a country that follows a specific religion that is, very much, relegated, like we are in the United States, to having two genders, right? You're either male or you're either female, and that puts a lot of people that don't identify that way out. So, but it's all culturally constructed, right? And they have power to determine that until you give them power to represent themselves. And that's what we're seeing right now. Even this election, we had I think, our first transgender person elected to the House of Representatives, right, to Congress, which is fantastic, right? It's absolutely fantastic because it's creating inroads, right? And even with Kamala Harris, I mean, the first woman of color to be elected vice president. I mean, that's, breaking some glass ceilings right there. So it does. It comes down to representation and who's in control of that representation, right? And who encourages that representation. And that's something else we're going to be talking about. Clothing, right? What's appropriate for clothing? Wearing certain shirts, or men having to wear a tie, or what's appropriate for hats, or jewelry. And then we have stuff like chores and jobs, right? What if we're at home and you've got kids? Are you going to send your male child out to rake the leaves, or are you going to send your female child out to rake the leaves? Historically, we would have sent the male child out to rake the leaves because that's an outdoor thing, and the girl would be, have to wash the dishes, right? Because we're reinforcing these stereotypes. Because if you were a kid, what did your parents send you out to do? What kind of chores were you forced to do? And were they gender-based? And in many cases, they were. So, when we look at all of these different things that we do as far as like gender-related activities, we see that they are constantly reinforced through all of these different means. And when we go into another community, another culture, as anthropologists, we're going to look around and we're going to say, okay, let's set my cultural bias aside. And let's see, are there multiple genders here? How are they treated? What kind of rights and privileges do different genders have? How is it being expressed? What kind of roles do they have in the community? So, that's a really important thing to start to understand, is how things are broken up in your own culture, right? How things are organized, and how you have been educated in those gender roles. Because if you, again, we had this conversation before when it came to race, okay? You could take anyone from around the world, put them into any other community, have that child raised, and they would be a part of that community. There'd be no difference. They would learn the language, they would learn the culture, all of that stuff. When we would do the same thing when it comes to males and females, if you were to take a male and raise that male as a female, doing all of these same traits, the likelihood is that they would culturally be raised up as a female, because it's all learned, right? It's all learned. So it all depends on how a community decides how its identity should be expressed. And gender is a huge thing when it comes to that. So, all right, so let's continue. So, again, talking about sort of these characteristics that men and women have. If we look at masculine, right? These are masculine identity traits. We're talking about aggressive, right? To be a man, you have to be aggressive, right? You have to be physical, you have to be tough, competitive, sports-oriented, testosterone, right? Driven, unemotional, right? These are all things that are oftentimes taglined with being masculine. What is sort of the masculine ideal within our culture? And oftentimes we have different ideas, but if we look at our media, and we look at like the sort of these main characters that we have that we idolize, especially when you look at the big series. If you look at like Marvel, where you've got big, tough, strong men that tough under any situation. And then you've got women, right? And then you've got women, and they're feminine, and they're gentle, and they're nurturing, and they're smart. Although that is not necessarily a traditional idea. Oftentimes it was seen that women should be docile, right? Not necessarily smart. They should be submissive. They should be persuasive or talkative, enticing, right? Emotional. But what we've come to understand is that while these traits are, masculine traits and feminine traits, that everyone expresses these traits more or less, equally. You can be a man and you can be nurturing, right? If you're a parent, right, you nurture your children. In different communities, sometimes we see, and there are lots of examples of this, where men weren't taught to be nurturing. And so you might have a family dynamic where the male parent didn't do a great job nurturing their children. Right? They had different obligations, different priorities within that community. You can also have within the same community, you can have stay-at-home dads. My best friend is a stay-at-home dad, even though he's got like 4 different degrees and has had his own business. His wife makes more money. And they're like, you know what? You make the money, you stay home and take care of the kid and raise that kid. And, as far as like this identity of being masculine and aggressive and all that stuff, it's not there, right? It's more about nurturing. It's more about understanding and being talkative and emotionally intelligent. And so we have the capability of expressing both these ideas of masculinity and femininity. But, because of our culture, we're taught to express certain things. We're taught to express that, men shouldn't wear makeup, right? You shouldn't wear makeup. That's a feminine thing, right? Do not color your lips. Do not put on rouge, all of that stuff. Eyeliner. And yet, in a lot of circles now, in a lot of communities, that it's becoming more acceptable to do that. Becoming more acceptable to be able to express yourself in different ways and have those feminine traits, right? So, and all of this can be circumstantial. It can also be intentional or unintentional, right? We raise our kids, let's say we've got a bunch of boys and we are intentionally teaching them to play football, right? Football is a tough sport and you have to be tough and you have to be strong. That's an intentional, trait that we teach our kids. An unintentional trait would be being at home and let's say something terrible happens. You have a family member that dies. But you see your father and maybe your grandfather, they don't cry, right? They don't show that emotion. They might be feeling that emotion, but they have been taught from a very early age to not show that emotion, to bottle those emotions up. And so those are unintentional things that we learn about gender. These are things that, you notice. You're not necessarily told that this is the way, but you see it and then you repeat it. So because they are influential members of your family, they are influential people in your life. So we see different ways that these traits are learned and then reproduced and practiced over and over again. Okay, so a little bit back to the biology. Are there more than two sexes? And the answer is yeah. And it's more of like we have two sexes and then everything that's in between. And this is where biology kind of takes us on a little bit of a joyride. Basically, about 2 out of every 100 people born are not born strictly male or strictly female. Sometimes they're born with, they might be born with like one testy and one ovary, right? They might be born with both sets. They might have all kinds of different things going on, any different number of combinations of sexual organs that, just because their body, their genes said, we're doing this, we're going this direction, right? And we're going to make this over here, and we're going to make that over here, and that's how it is. So, and that's 2 out of every 100 people. If you think about that, just think about that for a moment. Say you walk into a grocery store, and let's say there's 50 people in there at that grocery store at that time. At least one person has had some sort of, they were born as not male or female. They've probably had some sort of, more than often than not, like some sort of reconstructive surgery. And most of the time that's as a child, right, as a baby. And we talked about, for some of the examples, like doctors. Right? Well, what'll happen is sometimes, you might be born with both sets. And the doctor's like, well, this set here, maybe you've got more pronounced male genitalia. They're like, well, we're going to go ahead and classify this person as male. Even though it might not be fully representative of what a normal male genitalia might look like. But they're going to go ahead and do that. And they might have surgery where they might, if there are ovaries, they might remove them. Right? They might do other things that could determine the physical appearance or sometimes the biological workings of an individual to determine that sex. And part of that, too, is this cultural idea, right? And this is where government kind of falls into place. For our government, right, when we're born, what's on your birth certificate, right? Male or female. We don't have an intersectionality, right? We don't have an intersex. We have male, we have female. So even just to get the birth certificate done, right, we have to have that determination. And so when you're born, they're like, well, yeah, this kid's mostly female, so that's what we'll put on the birth certificate, even though they don't quite fit just female. So if we look at like Colorado or Denver itself, Denver's got like almost 3 million people in the Denver metro area. That's 50,000 people, right? It's a huge amount of folks that have this, difference from the standard male or standard female. And so where do they fit, right? Where do they fit in that in our society? And how do they self-identify? And we end up seeing lots of issues because as these sort of, and it's not done as much anymore. It used to be, so here's an interesting thing. It used to be that if a child was born and it showed these traits, in some cases the parents wouldn't even be notified that their child had this condition, right? This condition of being not quite male or not quite female. And the doctor would say, oh, we've got a problem. We'll be right back, right? And they might have to take that child into surgery to do some sort of correction and then come back and say, yep, you've got a healthy baby boy, right? What happens when that boy grows up and doesn't quite feel entirely like a boy? Because genetically, they're not entirely like a boy. What happens to those kids? What happens to those adults that don't know about their own biological history? They're not taught that there are different ways of doing things, that there is an intersectionality. So, we can see where culture can create confusion and identity issues when we're dealing with these things, right? So it can be tough. It can be really tough. And our culture itself, our American culture, we're having a really hard time dealing with any sort of concept of like a middle sex, or alternative gender, right? LGBTQ in general can oftentimes be seen as difficult to appreciate. And this is a big political concern. Colorado, which I'm a big fan of, has been more progressive than a lot of other states, and can be way more progressive than our federal government is. So, especially because we have a gay man who's our governor. I mean, I think about Polis being governor, and then I think about even 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, and how absurd that concept would ever be, right? How absolutely absurd that would be. But now, right, it's a reality, and a fantastic one. Whether or not you believe in his politics or not, it doesn't matter. Just the fact that it's, the expression is there. And in general, I'm one to, believe that, yeah, we should have more expression, right? People should be able to identify who they want to be. So, okay. Beyond that. So, our country, especially because of our government, but also our religious ideals, have had very strict rules about, how do we identify ourselves. And that can have a huge influence. Okay, so we basically just went over all of this stuff. Talking about, what happens to these folks that experience this this process, and that I think is really important to try and understand, is that it's way more common. It's way more common for this process of gender identification, of kids being born that don't fit the norm for being male or female, and that this is something that needs to be recognized and addressed, and we're seeing that. So, it's important to understand what's going on. We're getting to a stage in the United States and in our own culture that this is becoming more and more of an acceptable and an appropriate thing to not only be able to discuss, but also to handle. So, what about other cultures that deal with alternative sexes, right? Or alternative ideas of genders? We are primarily binary, right, in this country. But if you look at like in India, the Hindus as not only as a religion, but the community, there are different ideas about gender and about sexuality. And, there are still very much gender roles, but there are more genders to have those roles with. Southeast Asia is also a place where we find in some communities where there might be as many as 5 genders. Right? And how can you have 5 genders? Right? Aren't there just 2 sexes? Well, yeah, but again, it's about culture. It's about identity, finding that niche within that community, that how you feel about expressing yourself, how you feel about your own identity and the things that you were taught and learned and saw and decided that that's what you wanted to be, right? And so these different genders, which are not treated always as equals, but there's still acknowledgement, there's still expression of like, yeah, this is who you are, and we recognize that. In some Native American groups, there's a common term that's used that's considered like 2 spirits. And this is an idea in which one person might have both like male and female spirits inhabit them, right? That they can express, both male and female traits. They will take on either, you might be sexually a male, or you might not necessarily be one or the other, right? You could be a combination. And you will take on whatever role within that community that you end up taking, right? Whether it's male or female, it's not going to necessarily be determined by your sexual organs. And oftentimes these people are revered, right? That they have the ability to connect in a spiritual way that no one else can, right? So a lot of times these 2 spirits folks, or basically trans folks would have the ability to they would become spiritual leaders within a community. They might become healers because they are capable of dealing with both, right, or multiple, whatever that culture is. So there different cultures deal with these deal with people in different ways, and they deal with these conditions in different ways. Some are supportive, some are accepting, some are not so accepting, and they also change. If we look at a lot of Native American communities now, they are also dealing with LGBTQ issues. And part of that is, and this is something, again, we have to bring up, is that not all Native American groups are the same. They are just as culturally diverse as any other culture around the world, right? There's distinct identities. We have a tendency to, lump all Native Americans together. It's kind of like lumping all Americans together, right? We're not all the same. We have different cultures that we come from. Anyway, getting back to this idea is that in some Native American groups, LGBTQ rights are not always as appreciated, right? There are still issues, and this can be and sometimes is influenced by Western colonial influence, right? And how Christianity might take a very negative approach to gender identity outside of male or femaleness. So, there are lots of communities around the world that deal with identity in a different way, you know. So as Americans, you know, we have a very narrow view about gender identity. We have a very narrow view about sexual identity. And that's changing. And I think certainly changing for the better, because it's meaning that, you know, there's more equality for people that haven't had that equality, haven't had that access, or the ability to express themselves without concern. And I think that's really important, you know, just on a general basis, that, you know, you should be able to express who you want to be. I mean, it even seems to follow within sort of like, you know, the American dream, right? To be able to make yourself whoever you want to be, that you can be anything in this country. So, you know, it seems like it would be an American ideal to be able to do that. And I think in some very real ways it is, and that it's starting to be expressed. We're not fully there yet, but we're moving in the right direction. Gender and power, this should be fairly obvious, right? There's a huge disparity between men and women when it comes down to it. I think the last time I heard, I think the pay gap is starting to close, but I think it's still something around like 79 cents or 80 cents on the dollar for what a woman makes compared to a man for the same job. And that's just insane. That is just bonkers as far as I'm concerned. You know, you might have the same level of education, same level of ability, and yet not treated equally, and even different expectations. You know, again, I heard a story recently. They were talking about how the pandemic has sort of opened up a very interesting discussion when it comes to how men and women deal with work and responsibilities at home. And part of it is this sort of this, like, women are still considered to be homemakers. So if you have to sort of like decide who's going to stay at home to take care of their child because your child can't go to school because the schools are closed down, and what are you going to do, you know, for that kid? Well, women are more likely than men to leave their job and to take care of the child. And then even when men end up, you know, leaving the office and working at home, that the house chores and the stuff that might normally be done domestically by the woman is still being done by the woman, even if there's more, you know, equal time at the home. And these are sort of ingrained cultural practices that we have been taught, right? Have you ever been to like a football game, like a party at somebody's house, or a family reunion, and you've got like all the men, they're hanging out around the TV, they're watching the game, and the women are in the kitchen, right? And, you know, they're picking up dishes and preparing food and all that stuff. Those are very much gender roles that have been created, right? And it might seem normal, right? And it might seem normal that if you go over to your mother's house, that she takes care of you, right? That she's the one that, you know, will, you know, if she gets up, oh, do you want a drink, honey? Let me go get you something, you know? And it's not that you wouldn't also do that, but oftentimes those roles take place, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is what we're expecting to happen. So there's still this sort of difference when it comes to men and women, when it comes to you know, the roles in the family, and whether or not they're going to keep their job or go get a job to get an education. You know, what happens if you get pregnant while you're in school, right? Let's just say you're in college and then all of a sudden, you end up having a kid. What happens to your education? Is the school system set up so that you can continue your education, or do you feel the need to drop out? Right? That's a cultural decision right there. That's a decision by the institution to say, well, maybe it might be better for you to drop out. Maybe you need to take care of this kid. And then again, even like what happens to parents when, let's say they do have a newborn. In this country, we don't really have anything that says that you can take a couple of months off to take care of a child, let alone for a man to do that, right? If you go over to Scandinavia, man, if you're a woman, you can get like 4 months off, maybe even more, and that's paid leave to go take care of a newborn child. And men also get paid leave to make sure that they can go home and take care of the child. And we don't have anything like that. So, there are huge things that, as far as the organization, as far as governmental approaches and education, for a very, very long time, it was seen that men should be the only ones to go to college to get a degree. And this was turned into this idealized approach that, women weren't smart enough to go to school, right? They weren't logical enough. They were too emotional to be good students or to be good professionals or to be good educators. And those were men's responsibilities, right? And women should stay in the domestic sphere. And that is still a prevalent idea today, right? It's not as commonly followed, but there are still lingering aspects of that. So, and it is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty ridiculous. But it's something that you have to understand that's there, right? And that can influence your decisions. It's just like going back to what I was saying earlier when it comes to men and women as they go through school. There are more women that go to school, but there are more men that become professionals, that get jobs in their specific fields. Unless it's like things that are seen as domestic, like medical training, nursing, stuff like that, which are highly, highly dominated by women. But again, it falls into that sphere of caretaking, right? And even the idea that women are better nurturers, better caretakers. And in a real sense, they oftentimes can be, because men are not necessarily taught to do that, right? So when we look at gender and how it's sort of constructed and taught, we look at how the power balance can be pretty much unfair. Gender stratification. So what makes one gender worth more than another? And this is kind of an interesting subject to discuss, because if we look at things like, and I'll use a couple of different examples. So let's look at China. So China, for a long time, had a one-child law, because they were having a lot of kids being born, and guess what? Their resources were being taxed, and so the entire country said, one child, you can have one child, and that's it. What ended up happening is that you had a massive number of infanticide. because it was perceived that men would be better workers. They would provide more for that family. And so if you had a male child, you could raise that child to be a good contributor to the family, that they would bring in good resources, and that if you had a female child, that child would be a drain on resources, that at some point, you would have to marry that child off, and that would actually cost you, and there are different perceptions. So you ended up having a fairly large disparity between girls and boys within that country. Even here in the United States, we've had different ideas about the importance of gender. What can you produce, right? Are you a producer or are you a consumer, right? And men have oftentimes been the producers and women the consumers. And these things are reinforced, right? They're constantly reinforced with these ideas that one is better than the other. And we end up creating what is considered to be a gender ideology. Okay? Gender ideology is basically this concept in which, and we've talked about ideology in the past, especially like racial ideology, things that we expect certain types of behavior to come from someone, right? If we expect that a certain race and a certain gender is more violent than another, then we are going to behave appropriately towards that. So if we're talking about like, black men, right, have this reputation, even going back, for since slavery, right, that that they're aggressive, right, and going back to different terms in politics, even Hillary Clinton got behind this, super predators, right? They were calling specifically out black men, that they were super predators. And that influenced how we approach black men in general, and why there are so many that are shot and killed for no reason whatsoever, or abused for no reasons. And then why there is, again, this reprisal, and this idea, well, if I'm going to be treated like I'm going to be bad, then I will be bad. And you create this, absolutely terrible, awful cycle. And so we see these cultural ideals that take place. We expect, in this case, women to behave a certain way and to accept certain circumstances, and that it's all justified, and it's all completely justified. These beliefs, these practices, these ideas, that's just how it is, right? It becomes a part of the value system, right? And and it creates these gaps. It maintains these gaps, and it takes a long time to change those things. I mean, if we think about it, and this election is a perfect example of it. Kamala Harris being elected as vice president, she has achieved a rank within American governance beyond anyone else, beyond any other woman, and she's the 49th. She's the 49th vice president to achieve this. That's a long line. And so it takes a long time to change these values. And for the next, 20, 30, 40 years, we are going to be seeing the repercussions of this event take place. And you're going to see a lot of different changes take place in American culture because of this. But, we won't see some really amazing changes for another 20 or 40 years. And that's just because culture takes time to change those values and to change those ideas. And we can see that a lot of those values and changes are taking place just by the fact that she was elected. Everything else, though, it'll start to change, but it's gradual. There's also this idea, which I grew up with, man the hunter and woman the gatherer. Taking this idea that men, they're hunters, they're aggressive, they can go out and catch their prey and provide for their families and provide for their tribe. And women go out and they gather fruits and nuts and other different supplies, and but it's all passive, right? It's passive gathering, while the hunter is aggressively going out, the man is aggressively going out and killing something and bringing it back to provide, which, for all intents and purposes, for everything that we've discovered, to use a term from Biden, is a bunch of malarkey. The current idea about women participating in hunting is about 70% of women engaged in hunting practices. Okay, so it didn't necessarily mean that this was man's job and man was particularly, suited or constructed for hunting. Because again, that sexual dimorphism on average is only 15%, and that 15% is not a big distinction, right? It's not a big distinction. And also the fact that, when we're talking about gathering produced way more food on average than hunting does. So most men would be out there gathering whatever they saw. It's like, oh, here's a whole bunch of good stuff. I'm going to pick this stuff up. I'm not going to just go hunting and not gather stuff, right? So we had this idea constructed, right? That this is this cultural ideal that we should follow. Man the hunter, woman the gatherer. Man the provider, woman the caregiver. And what we understand as far as these gender roles is that, these ideas of masculinity and femininity, is that men and women both share all of these traits and express all of them in different ways, some more than others. But that the distinction between men and women is really quite small, that the emotional and physical capabilities are really not that different. The intellectual capabilities are non-existent. There's no difference between how smart a woman can be and how smart a man can be. So when you look at gender, when you look at gender roles, within your own family, within your friends, when you get together for a family reunion or a birthday party, or go out for drinks, and take a look at what's actually happening. What are men doing? What are women doing? What are the specific roles that each person has? And question those roles. Think about them. Wonder why. Why is that the case? So, because all of this stuff is culturally based, right? We've constructed these ideas. These aren't things that we are born with. We're taught all of this information. Our gender is constructed. So, and I love this concept of like the boys will be boys, right? And it's an explanation or a sort of a cop out as far as I'm concerned, as far as explaining someone's behavior, oftentimes in a negative way, right? Boys will be boys. They're going to go out and they're going to get into fights, or they're going to be promiscuous, or they're going to be out and engage in poor activities. They're going to go sow their oats. I love that one, sowing their oats. Basically being, and I hate using the word, but like a man slut, right? They're man sluts. They're sowing their oats. But there's the difference, right? It's okay to sow your oats. It's not okay to be a slut, right? So again, sort of this idea of what's appropriate for males to do versus what's appropriate for females to do, especially when it comes to like sexual activity. Men, they should go out and you're patted on the back. The more women you can bag, the better you are. I mean, those are trophies that you can have. Women, on the other hand, if you were to do the same thing, the connotations, the results can be very, very negative. And and very much hypocritical, for doing the same act, for engaging in the same types of activities. And so, what does that do for communities, right? What does that say for individuals who might go do that and behave in risky behavior, and not be told that hey, this is inappropriate. So, this concept of like boys will be boys is again strictly cultural. There's nothing out there that says boys will be boys, right? That kind of behavior is taught, it is learned, and there's no way of excusing that kind of behavior, especially when it has negative results. Especially when it can be harmful. So what is being done to change the atmosphere of gender inequality? Well, this is sort of where we come into a little bit of globalism, right? When we have more ways of being able to express different opinions, being able to express different ideas, learn new things, go to school, getting an education, having more women in education, having more women in businesses, making laws that say that there has to be equality, that there has to be, have to kill that pay gap, all of these things. We're seeing a whole bunch of different things that allow this. In our own culture, we have suffrage, right? We have women's right to vote. And women's suffrage is a very interesting thing to consider, because it also goes back to this idealism, right? So as women were finally allowed to vote, there were a lot of women that were against letting women vote, because they believed that women shouldn't vote. Wait a second, what? Just like sort of the idealism behind even we were talking about like, super predators and all this stuff. They became accustomed to the idea that women shouldn't vote because they weren't capable of voting, of making a good decision, that they were not involved in those discussions, and so they wouldn't know how to pick, right? Somebody that, or on different ideas on how to vote and what they believe in. And so even when women were given the chance to vote, it took a while for women to actually start voting, right? It wasn't something that just like every woman that was well, and let me get this absolutely clear: white women, okay, women's suffrage was about white women getting a chance to vote, not women of color. That didn't happen until the 60s. Okay, so white women were given the chance to vote, and they took their time doing it. An interesting little factoid about Colorado is that women were allowed to vote in 1893. So Colorado was the first state to allow women to vote. So I think that's fascinating and a nice little tidbit about Colorado. You know, but we still have a lot of issues to deal with. So, but these ideas around like what's appropriate, going back to like the idealism around women voting, and the fact that a lot of women felt like they didn't need to vote, right? They weren't prepared to vote. They didn't know what they should vote, or they would vote however their husband or father told them to vote. So there was control that was being expressed there, right? So, we look at how things have changed drastically over the decades, over the last 100 years. Considering that 100 years ago, women were, white women were given the right to vote, and now we have a woman of color as our vice president. That's pretty huge. And considering the amount of time that's taken place and how many generations, which is not a lot, have taken place since then, those are some pretty amazing results. Not enough, but we're moving in that direction. Okay, so let's talk about the conclusions about gender. We understand that gender and sex are not the same. That sex is the biological component. It's the expression of genes, and how 98% of people come out pretty much male or female, and that there's an intersexuality in between it, and that people are not always fitting those two designations, and we're learning how to deal with that. In our culture, it's been a rough road. In other cultures, they've adapted to it very well. But that we understand that that gender is culturally constructed. The ideas of whatever man is, the masculine traits or the feminine traits, are constructed. They are taught. They are learned. They are contested, right? All of these different things. Let's see. Gender is oftentimes dealing with cultural ideology, these ideas of what is reinforced. And there's a lot of things that we continually do to reinforce these roles, right? We have expectations of what a woman should be and what she shouldn't be, of the activities that she should engage in and what she shouldn't engage in, and that they are oftentimes at odds with what a man should be doing and what he shouldn't be doing. And so, and they're all influenced by, government and religion and school and family and all of these different things. We've looked at some of the issues facing gender and power and how these issues are changing and changing fairly quickly in the amount of time that they've been changing in. But there's still a lot that still has to be done, right? So, as we look at how we look at gender and identity and the expectations that we have as members of a culture, as family members, as workmates, as schoolmates, we need to look and address these issues. And I think that as an anthropologist, as a field, this is one of those situations where we really need to kind of dive deep and try and understand what's happening, and also encourage within our own community to bring people up. Again, we really want to talk about like equality and how we should all work together. And we can't do that if there's a pay gap. We can't do that if responsibilities are different for one, or accessibility to resources is less than. So, when you write up your homework, okay, think about how gender has affected you, right? How has your gender either given you an advancement, something that the other gender might not have, as far as a benefit, or what is something negative that your gender experiences, and write about that. Write about how some aspect of your life has been impacted because of your gender. And then I'll post the discussion question of how do we decide what is gender related. How do we determine what gender is? What are the things that we do? So I brought up the example of colors, right? Why do we give boys the blue color and girls the pink color, right? There's nothing that says that boys should have blue and girls should have pink. There's no biological reason for it. So why do we do it, right? So come up with your own idea on gender identification. How do we determine that? Why do women wear dresses and men wear pants? Why can't men wear dresses too? So yeah, consider that, and hopefully you guys have a great week. This was a long single video, so I apologize ahead of time. It just didn't seem to have a chance to break it in the middle. It's also a little bit shorter than some of my other lectures, so whether or not you like that, hopefully not. Hopefully you like listening to me talk. There's probably some of you that don't. That's okay. Anyway, I hope that you guys have a great week. Be safe. Be watchful, watch out for each other, wear a mask, and let's all move forward with kindness and courtesy, and openness and awareness, and we'll hopefully get through the next few weeks without a lot of incident. And so I hope all of you are safe out there. That's it. Okay, I'm signing off. We'll see you next week. Oh, yeah, there's like one lecture left after this. That's it. So we're getting close. As far as the papers are concerned, I've had a lot of people turning in their ideas late, but that's okay. And there's been a lot of great topics. I'm really very, very diverse group of topics. I'm really looking forward to reading them. So keep it up. As far as your homework is concerned, there have been a lot of people that have missed homework. Just do it. Just do it. Just do the homework. Even if it's late, those points will count. Okay. So, if you're worried about your grades, if you didn't do so well on the midterm, if you don't do well on the final, if you turn in your homework, you might not have to worry so much about getting good grades on the exams. And that's kind of how I, developed this course, is that the grades are a big part. And because of the pandemic and everything, I'm not worried about you turning them in late. Just get them in, turn them in, whatever you got to do, catch up, and they'll count. So just do it. Just do the homework, all of the homework. Get all the homework done. Okay, that's it. I promise. Be safe. Be kind. We'll see you next week.